Bon après-midi, depending on what time of day it is for any of you watching our program today with Alexis Landau, whose wonderful book, Those Who Are Saved, will be taking you to Paris, to France rather, not Paris, before the war, before World War II, and during the war, and slightly after the war, but also to the United States, to New York and California. So we have lots to talk about. We are expecting autographed copies from Alexis to arrive probably next week at the Poison Pen. So if you're enjoying the program today and you'd like to support Alexis for her second book, I urge you to order an autographed copy from us. So, welcome, Alexis.
Thanks for having me.
It's really a pleasure. I love the setup you've done there with the flowers in the book. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. These are from my best friend, as I mentioned.
You did?
So she's been very supportive.
How nice. So you said that when we talked just a little bit before we started the formal program that you wrote an earlier book which was set in World War I. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that and why you think this is a somewhat second generation book?
Yeah, well, the first book is called The Empire of the Senses, and it was about a highly assimilated German family, German Jewish family, living in Berlin. And the father, his name was Lev, and he also shows up in Those Who Are Saved, but he married a woman who was Gentile, and then he went to go fight World War I and came back, and it's a lot about what was building up to, in a way, World War II. So I wanted to understand that, and to understand that I felt that I really needed to understand World War I and Germany's role in that. So that was what the first book is really about. And then, Sasha in Those Who Are Saved is Lev's son. But of course, and so that's how the books tie together, but then the rest of the story is, totally new characters, and they're both standalone books. But I was thinking when I started Those Who Are Saved, I did want to write like the next generation, and I was interested in what would a son look like who was born basically during World War I, and this idea of like, well, then there would be the next war, and what would be his role, and what would be his whole like story and journey. And so in some ways, like, looks like it's becoming a trilogy. So, there might be a third book. And yeah, it's just so interesting. So that's kind of the backstory in a way. And then Those Who Are Saved follows Sasha and his and so we get to have like the golden age of Hollywood, and I love that, and I love film history, and it really brought LA to life for me in a more historical sense, because growing up here in the 70s and 80s, it was hard to feel that history so much, because there's the other part of LA which can be very superficial, and it feels like everything's always new and they're always tearing things down, and you're like, where's the history here? So that was, what kind of shaped his whole character. But then the Vera and Lucy story, there was this overlap in terms of all of the exiles, and Vera was part of that crowd who also came here for different reasons, to escape Europe. And, and once they got here, they created their own really vibrant artistic community in the Palisades and Brentwood and all of these places, again, that I grew up in that I didn't realize had this rich history. So I used to hike up Paseo Miramar, which is right off Sunset, and, walk by Villa Aurora and not even know it was there until I started digging, and it didn't actually take long to uncover all of this kind of rich trove of history and where these exiles lived, and what they did and what they talked about, and how they were very there was just this huge contrast between their experience here and obviously what was happening in Europe. So for me, like, I didn't want to write a World War II book, but it ended up being World War II. But it was, a lot of the book is about, what is it like to experience the war from a place in Los Angeles, you know, where there's not a lot of signs of it. And so there's this weird dissonance of, you know, their ability to adapt versus others who can't, while also knowing there's this horrible, you know, war going on. And so that kind of like tension was another thing that I found really interesting.
Well, the way you construct the story, because basically you've got three narrators. You've got Sasha, who we've already mentioned, and then we'll get to Vera in a minute, but then we also have some small sections from Lucy, Vera's young daughter, who was left behind in France. And we'll talk about Oradour in a moment, because that's really one of the really horrible stories, I think, of World War II. I have been to visit Oradour, and it's as though it happened yesterday. If you go there, you know, the memory of it is still intense and still really shapes people's lives. But Vera's interesting because Vera's backstory is Russian, and the Russian Revolution. So you've mentioned World War I, but certainly as a part of World War I, we have the Russian Revolution, the 1917, and what happened to Russian families. Not the families, but their culture, well, the jewelry comes into play in some senses, you know. Many of them had wealth. Those who had portable wealth were able to take it with them. Some of the characters in this book were prescient enough to transfer money, let's say, from Europe to the United States. Some of the Russian refugees who went to France were able to either transfer money or take things with them. And, you know, so a lot of this story, I think, is about expectations and how well people interpreted what was happening and what was going to happen and prepared themselves for it. And the ones that were in denial are the ones I think that suffered the most. Because you do have, in California particularly, but also even in New York, you do have people who left Europe when it was okay to do it. And then you had people who waited till it was too late and problems arose.
Or was at the very, you know, on the edge of the knife, or however, you know, you want to say it. But yeah, and I definitely, like, in my research, you know, I changed things around in the fictional account, but you know, like the Feuchtwangers who lived in Villa Aurora, you know, came from Germany, but they were already basically, he was on a tour of the U.S. in 1933 when, you know, all of that started in Germany, and so he basically couldn't even go back to Germany, right, because he was hunted and one of the main sort of targets. And so, but he did end up going to France because that was still considered in the 30s and even into the, you know, 1940, as it is in my book, it had the illusion of a safe haven, or a lot of people felt like, oh, it's okay here, you know, even if things are terrible in Germany, or, you know, there's so many Germans coming, you know, into France, but we're here and we're okay, and we're, you know, been here for a long time, you know. So there was this, yeah, it was definitely a false sense of security, but at the same time, you know, it's a hard thing to say, like, why didn't some people see it or understand the threat? And first of all, I mean, it was unimaginable, the horror, you know, so it was kind of like, you know, yes, Jews had been expelled from various countries in the past, and there were pogroms, and, you know, there were waves of anti-Semitism that, you know, people endured, and there was diasporas and this and that, but this was definitely, you know, unprecedented. So I think there was this idea like, oh, it'll pass, you know, this is not a great time, but we'll get through it. And, you know, we're in the south of France, and there's a free zone, and then there's the occupied zone, and we'll just have to muddle through. And that's, you know, again, that's ultimately what really obviously did not happen. But, you know, it's always easier to look back with 2020, you know, hindsight. And another phrase that always was echoing my mind was this idea of, like, and I think it's from Nietzsche, and he is not writing about obviously this time, but it's this idea of, like, being asleep in dreams on the back of a tiger, like, and I'm not quoting it exactly, but this idea that it's right there in front of you, but, you know, we all have our illusions. So I think, yeah, just playing with that and seeing how Vera and Max reacted, and also the crowd that they were in. I mean, they were highly assimilated. They had made contributions to culture. You know, she was a writer, he was a composer. They felt, you know, fully accepted and enveloped by France, and they really believed in the French kind of humanitarian spirit. And so I think in some ways that was really painful for Vera, at least, to realize in the book, you know, this isn't actually my country, even though she, you know, came there as a young child and really felt like she was French by the time World War II happened. But I also think another reason why it's so hard for her to leave France again, you know, is that she was, you know, as you mentioned, her family fled Russia. They were white Russians in 1917. And so there's this like double exile or double, you know, feeling of being ripped away from everything that you know and having to start over. And I think like for her, like having to do that again, you know, leaving France and coming to California was just like, it was so painful because it had these echoes of what she had experienced as a
end up in a number of people who made their homes in France. And you know, you mentioned it in the book, and it's true that really France was the lingua franca of Russia. The upper Russian classes didn't speak Russian. I studied Russian in college, and I still can speak some of it, but it's a harsh language. It's a more difficult language. French is an elegant language, and therefore, when they came to France, they didn't have a language barrier to overcome because they were already used to speaking it and felt French. And the other thing, too, which you also point out, which I hadn't really thought about, they were refugees, Max and Vera, the parents. But Lucy was born in France, and therefore, you know, was a French citizen, or at least, you know, you say that she was, and I imagine that that's how the law worked. So when it came time for them to make a decision, Vera and Max, about whether to go to the camp or whether, you know, then to try to escape France altogether, Lucy, being French, was part of the reason or Vera didn't want to, but part of the reason Lucy was left behind with her governess, who, if I remember right, was Vera's governess and came with them from Russia, was that she would be safer then, because originally her parents did go to a camp, and then from there made their way to Lisbon, climbed over the Pyrenees, and took ship to the United States. It seemed as though Vera would be safer in France with Agnes than, do I have that right? Was their name Agnes? Thank you. Than to make this hazardous trip and, you know, whatever. But ironically, and this is the part that you should fill us in on, ironically, leaving Lucy where they left her, or where she ended up, was the most dangerous place really in France, as it all turned out. The story of Oradour, a village, is a terrible one. So why don't you tell us about Oradour?
Well, yeah, it is this, like, you know, cruel irony, because it's in it's in southwestern France, and it's this, you know, really small, like, sleepy, you know, country town that you know, throughout the whole war was relatively safe. I mean, like, you know, there wasn't a lot of fighting or anything going on there, so it was a perfect place to hide Lucy. And it was a farming village, or, you know, I think that's where a lot of the industry was. And then what happened was a few days after D-Day, when it looked like the war, you know, that it wasn't ending yet, but the tide was turning and people were starting to get more hopeful, the Nazis basically raided the whole town, and it was really gruesome. And they put the men in one barn and the women and children in another, and they lit both barns on fire. And you know, basically, I think it was, I don't remember the exact number, but around 600 people died in one day, like within, you know, 3 hours. And it was on a Saturday, I think. And the reason it was not because of, you know, trying to, for trying to root out Jews or anything. It was just because I think they had found out or gotten wind of the fact that that town was harboring partisans or had like ammunition and was, basically part of the resistance. And so that was their way of punishing of the French people. And also some historians say it was a retaliation for D-Day. There's different interpretations, but yeah. And so that was like really, it was just so brutal to read about, and also to just think of, like you explained, because you've actually been there, but I didn't get a chance to go there. And I looked at so many photographs and pictures and things of the town before and the town after, and it's just devastating. It looks just like apocalyptic. And I think that they've completely kept it in terms of certain parts of the town, and you can fill me in, but that so you can actually still see the destruction, that they didn't just cover it up or put like new buildings there or something. So I mean, at least in the photographs I've seen, there's like still these cars that are rusted out and like this typewriter there, and you just sort of still feel like the life that people were living that was just completely extinguished within hours. So
there were a number of inexplicable Nazi events that I understand. The one I'm trying to remember because I'm having trouble with names today, but I think it was Heydrich that was assassinated in, what was it, Czechoslovakia or somewhere, and the Nazis came in and wiped out an entire town in retaliation. We lost Coventry to bombs. There's an author named James R. Ben who has written a very interesting series about World War II. It's from a male perspective, a fighter perspective. But one of the books that he wrote really deals well with the question of why they were able to, why the Nazis left Paris intact, because there was a real fear, that they were going to destroy the city. They were truly vengeful, and they had a scorched earth policy as they were going. And yet, for whatever reasons, they didn't destroy Paris when they could have. Yeah. So, Oradour is just one of those, who knows why they did it, but it was an incredibly savage act. It wasn't in retaliation for an assassination or something, but it probably was the area commander or whatever, whoever was at the top of the Nazi chain in that area, decided to. And there are stories like that in other countries too. I mean, where they did the same thing. So there wasn't any like sovereign command. It wasn't like Berlin said, let's take out Oradour, whatever. But the reason I bring it up is that it does complicate the post-war search for Lucy, because if she was there, did she survive? And if she did survive, where was she? And becomes very, very difficult to find her. And I don't want to give away the end of the story, but I do think there was a very compelling scene you have with a nun. And I mean, I've read a lot of medieval literature, and edited some books, in fact, about it, where oftentimes Catholics would, there's one really dramatic one in the north of England I've always remembered, where a Jewish mother is in trouble giving birth, and she refuses to let the local nuns help her, because in a case like that, her husband refused, actually. The Catholics would always save the baby so they could baptize it and let the mother go. And I think that was a real problem with Sophie, or no, Lucy, if she's alive, is what kind of decision would nuns in a convent, if that's where she took refuge, what kind of decision would they make in terms of her life if they wanted her to? I don't think we remember easily. France was really as bitterly anti-Semitic in many aspects as Germany was. And I mean, that's a Dreyfus affair, and definitely some people argue that before like the 30s, France was more anti-Semitic than Germany in some ways. So, and that's a whole other area. But I mean,
yes, there was actually a famous case, and now I can't remember the last name of these two boys who, they were in a convent during World War II, hidden. They were Jewish, and they were not, they were purposely not returned to their family after, because of this idea in Catholicism that, we've saved their souls and they're ours now, and so I think it's just really interesting when you see like the intersection of like, religious belief with, these more historical events and how it can coincide, and, they can be a savior, but at the same time have this other side that maybe you don't necessarily anticipate.
Well, it's not just French. I mean, we have a group here in New Mexico called Conversos, and these are Jews who came to the New World, came up to New Mexico from Mexico, and did either a forced or a voluntary conversion to Catholicism, but remember their Jewish rituals. They remembered the Sabbath and all the rest of it. But as they got further and further in time away from that, they didn't know why they were necessarily celebrating these things. And, so I married into a very prominent American Jewish family, and one of them has written a book about the Conversos, and I wasn't even aware of it. So, I mean, it certainly wasn't just France or just Germany. One of the places
it's been going on since the diaspora, for sure.
Yeah.
But, and it is, you're right, it is a like widespread, issue. But I do want to add that Lucy, I don't know if this is in the book, but maybe it was meant to be, or I was just thinking it in my head. I've written so many drafts that sometimes it's hard to remember like what actually made it in the book. But I think she is baptized, as sort of, I think it is in there, Vera and Max decide to do this. I think it was like in 1939 or 38, as a way to protect her and also themselves. And so, of course, that also didn't work. So, but there was definitely this, it's interesting when you think about just, and this is like a much longer discussion as well, but I actually wrote my dissertation on like assimilation and anti-Semitism, and just like when the shift happened from being, anti-Semitic in terms of like not the ethnicity, but the religion versus the ethnicity. And so that happened, and when that happened, and I think Germany really drove that home, it became much more about your blood as opposed to just whatever religion you were, so therefore converting, it didn't change yourself, in the way that maybe some Jews thought that it would if they converted. So, but before that, there was this idea that, if you convert, then, you're no longer Jewish. And so there's this whole idea, like, what does it mean to be Jewish? Like, even if you convert to Catholicism, you're still Jewish. And so I think, like, that's in part to what it touches on very lightly, but it's there.
Interestingly enough, I grew up in Winnetka, north of Chicago, and I went to New Trier High School, which was, for some fluke reason, and just naturally, approximately a third Catholic, a third Jewish, and a third Protestant. It just turned out that way from the composition of the suburbs. But in Chicago itself, there would be clubs. The Standard Club, for example, was limited to Jewish members. Good friend who was Jewish, and I could go as a guest to her country club, but my family could not have joined it. And similarly, she could come as my guest at the country club my parents belonged to, but her family would never be allowed to. So there was an awful lot of, it wasn't life-threatening, but there was, and it's like that movie, The Gentleman's Agreement, which I think is Gregory Pecker somewhere. There was a lot of, I don't even know if it was anti-Semitism, because it ran both ways. But anyway, there was a lot of de facto segregation or restriction that wasn't going to kill people, but nevertheless really shaped your lives in interesting ways. So by taking your Vera and Max from New York into California, which was very much a new society in a lot of ways and very creative. And so a lot of Jews were attracted to California because of the movie industry or whatever, you know, and composing, and you've got a lot of figures like that. And I thought that added a lot to your book, that real people like Kurt Weill and so forth were part of the, I mean, obviously Vera and Max were fictional, but you have some great scenes in New York and in California where we can see a mix of artists or socialites or whoever, you know, that had come over when it was probably had come when it was safer and easier to do it than the way Vera and Max arrive on a ship from Lisbon.
Were here already,
right?
Especially the ones like from Vienna or Berlin.
Yeah.
And they were more established, and so that's why they were able to help, you know, people like Vera and Max who came, you know, later and were, you know, much more desperate and unprepared. And like Salka Bertel is like a, you know, she was like the grande dame of the whole, you know, exile community, and she was married to a famous playwright, and she also was a screenwriter, and she like would have these salons at her house, you know, on Mayberry Road, which was near where Vera and Max live, and I can literally walk there from here, from my house. And so there were like these, you know, central points of gravity where the exiles would meet, and they would have some, I guess you could say, like comfort or consolation in each other, but at the same time, I mean, there was so much loss that they all, you know, were dealing with in different ways, and people,
sure,
you know, couldn't really talk about it because it was so painful. So it was kind of like, you know, let's just keep going and, you know, trying to get that job at MGM composing, or, you know, just trying to survive here and get through the war years. And some of them did better than others and adapted more quickly, and, you know, others hated it here and one of them said it was a sunny blue grave, or, you know, there were no cafes and nothing, and what's all this nature. And, you know, Bertolt Brecht, I think, was particularly grumpy out here. But at the same time, they all tried their hand, not all of them, but many of them tried their hand at Hollywood, you know, and there is still that draw of like, come out here and, like, you know, write for TV, and it'll be a lot easier than like slaving away on a novel for 10 years. So, well,
yeah, it was certainly a dramatically different culture than the cafe society and so forth of Europe. But anyway, to get back to the story, so what we meet Max and Vera and Sasha early on in the book, and gradually their stories begin to dovetail. So Max and Vera leave Lucy with Agnes in France and have a exciting trip over the Pyrenees, and eventually land in Lisbon and take ship and get to the United States, and rather than staying in New York, go to California. And then Vera and Sasha's life begin to intersect, and eventually in this quest to find Lucy when the war is over, because Vera has never come to terms with leaving her, never is going to come to terms without finding out what happened to her daughter. Eventually Sasha becomes the person that joins her on this quest, and, you know, he has a whole different thing going on. He and his mother have a difficult relationship, and so they eventually go back to France and try to find Lucy. But I think it's interesting the way that you tell Sasha's story, because he's so different, and then how he and Vera intersect. If they had, for example, stayed in New York and not gone to California, it would have been a different story. So, yeah, you know, it's an interesting progression, and it's interesting to read it because you keep seeing it from different points of view. And I think you're very good about dating it, so, and which person is speaking, because each of the chapter headings will say Vera, and then it will say, like, you know, 1940 whatever, and then eventually. So it isn't hard as a reader to keep track of where you are and who you are listening to as you move through it. But it's interesting, the confluence of all this stuff, how it gradually all ends up in one place. I thought you did a wonderful job, and I can imagine it took you a lot of drafts to do it.
Yeah, it did, and especially like Sasha's progression or his arc and how that does dovetail with Vera's, as you said, and this idea of like why they are attracted to each other, and what is that spark. And I think, you know, it's hard because in one way, you know, she's trapped in her grief, and you know, as a grieving mother, you're not exactly like running off to have an affair with someone, but it's different than that. You know, it goes much deeper because you know, she's trapped in the past and in her grief, and basically really can't, you know, live in a way. Like she's just, you know, I mean, she gets a job, but like she's not really alive, you know. But she also wants to keep the lights on for herself if she does find Lucy, you know, in a way. Like she can't just give up entirely. And Sasha, in a way, is someone who doesn't want to, you know, think about his past. He's sort of running away from it, and is overcompensating in a way by being all about the future. You know, he's very optimistic. He has a lot of hope. He's really ambitious. It's like he's forward motion and she's, you know, stuck or going, always looking back. And so I sort of felt like that in a way, his grief and his loss and what he's not willing to look at was much more buried under the surface, but it was a deep wound, and her wound is in a way similar, but much more raw and fresh. And so in that way, they kind of came together and you could argue, you know, transform each other through their relationship. And I mean, that's just, for me, like love stories, and like a lot of times why people fall in love is like they have that unconscious, like under the surface link to each other that, you know, maybe on the surface of things doesn't look at all like possible, or, you know, like why would they be together, but a lot of times I see that.
That's very true. I'm laughing because many people think that my marriage, which is now 31 years old, are two completely different people. Right, Patrick?
That's right.
It's right. I mean, we don't appear to be an obvious couple, but it's strange how we manage to connect. And we're not really that far apart in our fundamentals, even though we are very far apart in many other respects. Let me ask Patrick, since I've called him over here, we've got any comments or questions you would like to bring up?
Not yet.
Okay. He says not yet.
So
there's you know, there's certainly a mystery in the book. I mean, basically, the oldest form of storytelling in many respects is a quest. And, you know, this is, despite all what we've been talking about, really is a quest. Is Vera's quest, you know, to find her child. It takes a long time to do the setup for the quest, but the urgency of the quest, which comes along as we move closer and closer to the target, I think becomes very apparent. But, you know, it's... we were talking the other night, I did a multi-person thriller event, and we all discussed the idea that, you know, thrillers are basically quests. They are.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's, you can go all the way back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and, you know, you're on a quest. Right. So I like stories like that, and I find it's a marvelously fluid form because so many different stories can be told with that same dynamic, and this is certainly one of those. I mean, it's a love story, it's history, it's a lot of things, but it's also really is a quest story, and I think that's fascinating. What is it that you got your PhD in, and what is it you're teaching?
I have my PhD in English Lit and creative writing, so it was like a dual program at USC, which was great because while we were reading a ton, you know, and that was like one track, we also had to write and produce, you know, fiction, which was the other. So you were sort of doing both simultaneously, which is essentially what I just want to do forever, like read and write, you know. So it was amazing, and I teach writing at USC, but it's more, I would say, like critical thinking and how to make an argument and like rhetoric. Right. So it's a little bit more, I don't want to say dry, but, you know, it's not creative in that sense. Finding their voice, and that, you know, their argument is obviously stronger when they have an original voice that's captivating on the page. And I don't know, I really like being around young people and their energy and their ideas, and just hearing, you just get this like infusion of life. And so it's nice. I really like it. But I, unfortunately, with the pandemic, I'm not teaching right now. I'm on furlough, and I'm managing my own children's education, which is also pretty rocky. So it's kind of, it's sad. I had to, in some ways, make the choice, like, do I teach my students, or do I make sure that my 8 and 10-year-olds are learning? And so I decided I have to really, stay on them until they're back in school and they have, much more infrastructure, I guess you could say, to make sure they're learning. So that was kind of a tangent, but yes.
But publishing a book is actually an excellent credential for a person who's teaching creative writing, so it's not entirely wasted effort. Patrick's an English major, and one of the things he says to me for when we're doing this, it came up the other day, is that because I am so old, my memory takes a long time, and I misquote somebody, or, and Patrick saves me by the little chat box will pop up and he'll say, no, it's not really D.H. Lawrence's Thoreau or something. So I'm very grateful that that he's able to do that. But, you have to ask yourself, what can you really do with an English major? Or,
right.
And it almost it really drives you into books.
Yeah, and I think teaching is an amazing thing, but not everyone likes that or wants to do it. And I didn't think that I would want to do it at all. I was really shy and introverted and afraid to speak up in class when I was in college, and basically got an anxiety attack every time I raised my hand. And so I think it's just weird that now I'm, teaching and telling kids, I want to hear from you, but I understand if you're too scared, but really try, So I do miss it and hope that we'll be back.
I'm sure it makes you a more empathetic teacher if you've had those experiences yourself.
Yeah. No,
right.
I mean, I know there's a difference between participation and, like, I always tell them, I can tell when you're participating, even if you're not the loudest person in the room. I can see when you're listening, and I can see when you're not, but you don't need to be constantly talking. Right. So anyway, but I really miss teaching, and I think, and I was a religion major for undergrad, and again, people were like, what is that? What do you do with that? And I didn't really know, but I just studied what I loved, and I still love studying religion and thinking about that, and that's a whole other topic. But I guess what I'm saying is you just don't know where those paths are going to lead you. And I have noticed in recent years that a lot of my students are not studying what they love and are, understandably really pressured to, have whatever it is, engineering degree or law degree, or working towards something that's much more, I guess you could say, tangible in terms of what their path would be. And that's like a whole other conversation about, college and liberal arts and, why people go to college. But I was lucky enough in like the late 90s, a lot of my friends and I were just like, we're religion majors, we're art history majors. Like, we didn't feel necessarily this pressure like we had to, go to law school or something. So. Well,
there's a difference between education and vocational study.
Right.
And the great thing about being a writer is that nothing is ever wasted. Nothing in your life will be wasted. And it's also, oddly enough, true of book selling. There's almost, I couldn't have these conversations on the insane variety of topics with many authors and many books, and Patrick the same, if we didn't have that kind of a background, because, every conversation is a pivot. It truly is. And I think we've risen to the occasion really well. But a lot of it is because we've had, such an eclectic. I was a French and political science major at Stanford. I have graduate degrees in history and library science and so forth. I've been a librarian, I've been a lawyer, and I've been a bookseller for 31 years. Nothing of it is wasted. So here we are. Anything that you'd like to add there, Patrick, or questions you'd like to ask her yourself?
Well, a couple of things. Actually, Alexis, you teach at USC, you said?
Yeah.
Do you know Percival Everett?
I do. I mean, I'm not like friends with him, but of course I know who he is, and he teaches fiction or creative writing in the English department.
Yeah, what a great writer.
Yeah, no, they've got amazing writers, and Amy Bender was my mentor, and I love her, and her writing is really magical in so many ways. So it's been a really great community to be part of. But yeah, most of people have not seen each other for, over a year, so, or about a year by now.
My dad went there in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Well, I do have a couple of questions here. Alice asks, were there any surprises in the writing of this book, and what do you hope readers will take away from it?
That's a great question. I think in terms of writing the book, like, I always knew where my endpoint was, but it was more about how am I going to get there. And so I think there were some surprising twists and turns that happened during revision and all the multiple drafts where, I thought definitely this is how, things are going to be, resolved in the end, and then it totally changed. So I think in that way, it was surprising. And then also the other thing that was surprising was that when I started writing it, I really thought it was more of a love affair or a love story. And then my editor was really like, she's like, no, the beating heart of this book is the mother's search for her daughter. And that was still going on, but like, she really, and she was right. And so yes, that was weirdly surprising because it was already written, but it was like, this is what your book is really saying. And then I also realized after I finished it that I'm writing another book that is a lot about the more like the symbolism of the Demeter Persephone myth of the Greek myth, where the daughter Persephone is abducted by Hades, who's king of the underworld, and then her mother Demeter basically stops all life on Earth to find her, and ultimately she gets her back, but with a caveat, that basically for 3 months out of the year Persephone has to go back into the underworld, and that essentially explains the seasons for the Greeks. And so I did realize, like, oh, this is in some ways too like another iteration of that myth, because Vera is like this grieving mother. She cannot really go on, and is so filled with rage and grief at what not having her daughter, and she, if I don't want to give anything away, but this idea that, and it relates to the title, like those who are saved and those who return, like, yes, that is true, that does happen to a certain extent, but like there's a huge cost of what was also lost. Like the two are so intertwined, so the light and the darkness, it's all in there. It's not like, oh, the end, it's just we're full of light and joy, like it's almost like you can't have that without having to recognize the great pain and suffering that created that to happen in the end. So that was another thing that I kind of realized after I wrote it. I think that was the question. I don't know.
Yeah. Another question from Judy, and she asks, when time allows, what do you like to read?
Everything, but of course fiction. And I'm reading right now Send For Me by Lauren Fox, and I'm really enjoying it. It's also World War II, but it's different. There's similarities to my book. And I'm, there's so many books, but I love Elena Ferrante. Right now I'm sort of on a female writer kick. Rachel Cusk, Deborah Levy, like these are all my favorite writers, but I did just read The Immortality Key, which is nonfiction, and I highly recommend it. And it is historical, and it is about, again, I'm researching ancient Greece and Rome right now, but it's really fascinating. It's about these sort of early mystery cults, and the connection that it has to Christianity. So he sort of has like this pagan continuity hypothesis, which I love. And it kind of goes back to my comparative religion, background. So yeah, I loved it. And it was somewhat, even though it's nonfiction, it did have a quest in it. So he went to some amazing places to do his research. And this was all right before COVID hit. And yeah, it's amazing. So I recommend that book.
I'm going to throw in a pitch for Mary Renault and her two books, The King Must Die and The Bull from the Sea, which I think are absolutely fabulous along those topics. And Lloyd Alexander wrote a brilliant young adult trilogy. I think it's more than 3 books, might be 5. Anyway, based on the Mabinogion. And so if you're interested in that, those are wonderful books for young readers to get them to understand the Celtic myths as opposed to the Greek myths. So fascinating stuff, but I think you have to go a long way to beat Mary Renault in those 2 books. They are just extraordinary. Wonderful. Anything else, Patrick, before we wind up?
I think that's just about
Great.
it.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I hope that everybody watching it has enjoyed it and learned a lot. And let me remind you that we will have autographed copies of those who were saved probably at the end of next week. It's a wonderful novel to read. And also it's a very good book club. I think it's a very good book discussion sort of book. So if you're involved in book clubs, you might want to think about that. So, au revoir.
Thank you.
My French for goodbye. Anyway, it's been great. Thank you very much. A real pleasure to meet you. And goodbye, everybody.
Me too. Bye. Thank you.